Israel, as soon as we made the deal, they came out and they dropped a load of bombs, the likes of which I've never seen before. The biggest load that we've seen. I'm not happy with Israel. You know, when I say, okay, now you have 12 hours, you don't go out in the first hour and just drop everything you have on them. So I'm not happy with them. I'm not happy with Iran either. But I'm really unhappy if Israel's going out this morning because of one rocket that didn't land, that was shot, perhaps by mistake, that didn't land. I'm not happy about that. You know what? We basically have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the fuck they're doing. Do you understand that?
About destruction. Speak about destruction. Speak about destruction.
Welcome to Blowback. I'm Brendan James.
I'm Noah Colwyn.
And this is something new and different. That's right. We are bringing you, our subscribers, the very first Blowback miniseries entitled No Daylight.
Exclusive to subscribers, this will be a 3-part series covering and interrogating the conflicts, the low points, the other side of a very special relationship in U.S. history, that of the U.S. and the State of Israel.
We are writing and recording this series in early 2026. At this moment, the U.S. and Israel are at war with Iran after having launched an unprovoked attack on the Islamic Republic. You could say this is an aftershock of October 7th, 2023, and Israel's subsequent assault on Gaza, a military campaign which Israel describes simply as a war, but which also bears the marks of an extermination campaign not unfamiliar to listeners of this program.
Whether or not this latest war is over by the time you hear this, it is clear that in 2026, the U.S.-Israeli axis has reached new heights of collaboration. The Biden administration bent over backwards to support and accommodate Israel's genocide in Gaza, while the Trump administration has subsequently taken things one step further by participating directly in Israel's decades-long mission to start a war with Tehran.
Whether in the aftermath of October 7th or the attack on Iran, many Americans who perhaps previously considered the U.S.-Israel relationship an uncontroversial issue have been left gobsmacked by the lengths the U.S. government will go to stand by Israel, a small yet highly aggressive and militarized pariah state in the Middle East. And many are asking a question that they simply hadn't before. Why?
These days, as ever, the usual answer, that Israel and the United States share mutual interests in the region, doesn't quite pass muster. So some have opted instead for the theory that Israel, through blackmail and financial leverage and whatever else, more or less possesses turnkey control of U.S. foreign policy. Still others submit that Israel is an obedient proxy for Washington, a loyal enforcer of American policy. Does the dog wag the tail, or the tail wag the dog? It's hardly a new debate for people familiar with this history, but it is new for many Americans.
Both theories have their points, but also their problems and puzzles. If Israel pulls the strings of U.S. policy, for example, why has it taken until 2026 for it to get its all-important war against Iran? Why not 30 years ago, when Israeli lobbying for such a war began? On the other hand, if Israel has been merely a tool of the United States, why should the infamous Zionist lobby, whose job is to bribe, electioneer, and manipulate American politics, exist in the first place? And why have Israeli spies been caught stealing U.S. secrets, slipping their own intel to U.S. lawmakers, or attempting to sabotage American policy? As Bill Clinton once put it, privately, after being disrespected by a recently elected Benjamin Netanyahu, who's the fucking superpower here?
We'll see in this miniseries many American presidents, generals, and diplomats oppose Israeli actions, and in the earlier days, even oppose the very idea of a Jewish state in Palestine. yet will also see surrender and the defeat of Israel's critics and opponents within the American government.
History, of course, is filled with examples of a powerful empire getting the short end of the stick from a small regional ally. So too with Israel. There is a baseline tension between Washington and Tel Aviv. The history of that tension and what it could spell for the future is the subject of this miniseries. This series will focus on 3 key moments of the U.S.-Israel relationship. The first episode will cover the battle over Israel's foundation. President Harry Truman and nearly his entire foreign policy apparatus opposed for years the establishment of a Jewish state demanded by the Zionist movement, until an exhausted and incurious Truman surrendered to political pressure. We'll then see how that newly formed state ran afoul of the Eisenhower administration, both by attacking the Suez Canal and perpetrating a massacre of Palestinians that generated a scandal, which itself led to the formation of AIPAC, the most influential and notorious pro-Israel lobby still in existence today.
We'll jump ahead to the 70s, where we shall see President Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger formally deputize Israel as a Cold War ally, ballooning America's commitment of weapons and military hardware to Tel Aviv. Ronald Reagan, who was then swept to power as a right-wing Cold Warrior and a pro-Israel zealot, he would, in the early 1980s, then find himself at odds with the Israelis as they brutalized southern Lebanon and ran spy games in the U.S. itself.
Finally, we examine the most aggressive and perhaps the last meaningful confrontation with Israel from a sitting U.S. president, George H.W. Bush, who publicly took on the Israel lobby and Israel's leadership itself when he demanded a halt to settlements in the West Bank. This unprecedented hostility escalated to a standoff in which Bush withheld $10 billion, billion with a B, in loan guarantees to force Israel's hand. And just clarity for the listeners here, this is a mini-series. This is not going to be an exhaustive blowback-style treatment of the history of Palestine, the history of the European colonization of Palestine, or even the entirety of the U.S.-Israel relationship. We're going to be zeroing in on certain moments in which the friction and tension of the U.S.-Israel relationship came to the forefront. And it's going to be a little breezier. It's going to be a little bit more self-contained than the full seasons you've gotten of blowback in the past. So please enjoy it for what it is, and you will be hearing about season 7 very, very soon. And in the meantime, we hope you enjoy this. With all that being said, along the way, you'll hear interviews we've conducted with Rashid Khalidi, Douglas Rossinow, and Seth Enziska. Our interviews with these scholars and experts, as well as the works that they've authored, formed much of the backbone of the research for this series, and in this first episode, we are particularly indebted to John Judas's book Genesis, Alonzo Hambi's book Man of the People, A Life of Harry S. Truman, and Michael T. Benson's book Harry S. Truman and the Founding of Israel. So without further ado, let's head into the year 1945. The territory we recognize as modern Palestine has been a possession, a so-called mandate of the British Empire since the 1920s. Its government is a British colonial administration, ruling over an Arab majority and, by now, a significant Jewish minority.
In the half-century before World War II, Jewish immigrants had been filing into Palestine, originally pursuing more of a religious or cultural presence, but increasingly forming a project to take over all of the land in a political project. By the end of World War II, Jews made up roughly 1/3 of the population in Palestine, and their leaders were set on imposing a Jewish state over all, and they meant all, of mandatory Palestine.
Now, post-war and after the revelations of the Nazi Holocaust, Zionism is no longer perceived as a somewhat odd and messianic phenomenon on the periphery. Increasingly, in 1945, it is widely viewed by Western Jews as well as progressive and liberal Gentiles, as a potentially restorative project to secure the safety of Jews across the world.
But it will take a ruthless, muscular Zionist movement, with a power base moving from Britain to the United States, to push Washington and the American public, to push them past, say, objections from the indigenous population in Palestine, and the injustice of colonizing their land, and the disturbing methods by which the Zionist movement sought to establish Jewish supremacy across its lands.
The Zionist movement saw a path to a Jewish state. They had only to win over the American president, the self-proclaimed best friend the Jews have in America.
We cannot shirk leadership in the post-war world. The problems of our economy will not be solved by timid men mistrustful of each other. We cannot face 1946 in a spirit of drift and irresolution.
In the spring of 1945, as Harry S. Truman took the reins of the American government, the White House press secretary wrote of him, quote, "In the long cabinet room, he looked to me like a very little man as he sat waiting in a huge leather chair." End quote. Truman, a machine politician from Missouri who had inherited the presidency from the late Franklin Roosevelt, liked to project an image of a tough-as-nails street fighter. On his desk in the Oval Office lay a plaque that read, "The buck stops here." But in private, according to his biographer Alonzo Hamby, Truman was more open about the fact that he felt overwhelmed by the mantle handed to him, quote, "like I have been struck by lightning."
And nowhere was Truman's tendency to fret, to stew, and eventually to cave in more evident than on the issue of Palestine. He was, especially in his first year, attempting to play catch-up with his predecessor. FDR himself had left things open in a way that suggests he was not very sympathetic to the goals of the Zionist movement. During a meeting with a pair of leading Zionist rabbis, Roosevelt had remarked, quote, "To think of it, two men, two holy men, coming here to ask me to let millions of people be killed in a jihad."
Harry Truman, in the early days of his administration, came at Palestine from a fairly simple and probably ignorant position. Compared to the aloof and eloquent Roosevelt, Truman was nasty, brutish, and short-statured. He also sported the quotidian anti-Semitism of his day, once writing to his cousin after visiting New York City, quote, "This town has 8 million people. 7.5 million of them are of Israelish extraction. 400,000 are WAPs, and the rest are white people." End quote. Yet, writes John Judas, the author of the book Genesis, close friends and confidants of Truman were Jewish, and he didn't have in his veins the bloodthirsty or conspiratorial anti-Semitism of your Hitlers or your czars. End quote.
Truman did have a personal attachment to the Bible, but he was not particularly religious. "I leave that to Mrs. Truman," the president said. And he was no kind of Christian Zionist. Even as a senator, Truman was one of only 17 in 1944 who opposed a resolution calling for the creation of a quote-unquote free and democratic Jewish commonwealth in Palestine. As president, he once told the visiting Zionist leader Chaim Weizmann that he rejected the idea of a Jewish state, or any kind of ethno-religious state, calling the very idea of Israel a theocracy.
We spoke to scholar Doug Rossenow about Truman's relationship to Zionism and how he approached the question of Palestine, having inherited the office from Roosevelt.
Truman was not an eager Christian Zionist, although in his retirement he was occasionally willing to accept praise along those lines and to retrospectively pose in that role. Some historians, critical historians today, view Truman as a bit of an ignorant bumbler and see him as out of his depth on many issues. And perhaps there's some truth in that. Truman himself was known to say that to express some modesty about his own abilities. The eager Christian Zionist narrative, I think, is not supported by the evidence. There's too much evidence to the contrary. So maybe the real question is how inept Truman was, how much he was pushed around by his political advisors, and how much he just made a decision in the way presidents often do, which is something messy.
Michael Benson, in the book Harry Truman and the Founding of Israel, has some nicer things to say about Truman and his competence, including toward Palestine, characterizing memos from the Secretary of State and that department in general as patronizing, something Truman agreed with. Quote, Truman recalled 25 years later that in those days nobody seemed to think I was aware of anything. His memory of these memos was still vivid. A communication from some of the striped pants boys warning me, in effect telling me to watch my step, that I didn't really understand what was going on over there in Palestine, and that I ought to leave it to the quote-unquote experts. Rashid Khalidi put it to us that Truman was more conversant and therefore more confident to listen to his domestic advisors, who, as we'll see, were generally pro-Zionist, as opposed to his State Department and his Pentagon, which were very skeptical indeed of a Jewish state.
You had basically a domestic constituency of political advisors to the president, who really, I think, in most cases had his ear, because those are the things he understood. And you had people at the State and the War Department, later the Pentagon, and the OSS, later CIA, who are telling Truman, well, you know, we have these other issues that Roosevelt signaled when he went and met with him and said. Obviously, the former won out.
Truman's political base, however, complicated this apathy toward Zionism. The New Deal coalition that he inherited was made up of labor unions and their rank and file, and racial, ethnic, and religious minorities such as blacks, Catholics, and, especially in New York State, Jews. 87% of Jews voted for FDR in the 1940 election, and Truman, a political animal, if nothing else, was desperate to keep intact the democratic machine that had been assembled by Roosevelt and the architects of the New Deal. This fact was not lost on the leaders of the American Zionist Emergency Council, or AZEC, the most significant and influential Zionist lobbying group then active, led by the hardline Rabbi Hillel Silver.
Before AIPAC, which we'll get to, the most effective and organized Zionist group in America was this self-described Emergency Council. It was AZEC that was responsible for the congressional resolution in 44, the one calling for a Jewish state that Truman didn't have any time for. In the coming months and years, AZEC would mobilize hundreds of thousands of constituents, many a Democratic voter, to pressure the Truman administration into backing the Jewish settlers in Palestine. The key leader of the group, Hillel Silver, was a Lithuanian-born reform rabbi who would wrest AZEC's policy from more moderate elements and set the Zionist movement's goal as a total colonization of all of Palestine. Not two states, certainly not a federal or binational state, just one Jewish state, ruling over any remaining Palestinian Arabs, many of whom would likely flee for neighboring Arab countries one way or another. The Jewish settlers in Palestine finally had a credible spokesman in Washington as extreme as they were.
Dr. Abba Hillel Silver of Cleveland presents the recommendations of the Jewish Agency.
I believe that the Committee of Inquiry should most certainly visit Palestine. Written documents are important, but infinitely more instructive are the living documents, the visible testimony of creative effort and achievement. In Palestine, they will see what the Jewish people, inspired by the hope of reconstituting their national home after the long, weary centuries of their homelessness, and relying upon the honor and the pledged word of the world community, has achieved in a few short years against great odds and seemingly insurmountable physical handicaps.
AZEC already had allies in Congress, and though it may sound odd to some listeners, in that time, Zionism was a political cause associated with American progressives.
I've skimmed this research, and the whole thing's pretty red. These communes, kibbutzes, it's positively Soviet.
Except the Daughters of the American Revolution shuttling this book up and down Fifth Avenue.
It's a good story.
Publications such as The Nation and the pre-Murdoch New York Post would slam Truman for his failure to support the Zionist movement and the Jews in Palestine. From your average American progressive to titans of the public sphere, such as celebrated theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, liberals simply abandoned their principles when it came to Palestine's Arabs, writes Judas. This marked them as even less sympathetic to the Palestinians than President Truman, who would at one point observe, quote, Zionists seem to have the same attitude toward the underdog when they are on top as they have been treated themselves.
A certain ignorant precept of the times explains how people who ostensibly cared about liberal concepts of the era, such as self-determination or anti-colonialism, told themselves that Zionism was compatible with those ideas. That precept was the idea that Palestinians were simply a fungible Arab population who were not being unfairly uprooted from their land or culture because there was plenty of Arab land and culture in the societies next door. As absurd as it may sound, this idea that an Arab people was easily exchangeable from one country to the next was a major talking point from the Zionist movement and was swallowed down by their allies in the West, some of whom happily repeat it today. Those pushing the idea somehow never confronted, or chose not to confront, why this logic could not apply to Jews as well, and were actively disgusted when American or British statesmen suggested that displaced persons from Europe relocate, if they wished, to other parts of Asia or Africa.
A relentless lobby, committed Zionists in Congress, and an outraged, progressive, and democratic media establishment. This is what Truman was up against.
This political landscape would spark divisions within the United States administration itself. As we'll see, broadly speaking, the State Department and its leading minds opposed the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine and favored a binational or federal state, inclusive of both Palestinians and Jews. Some, like Secretary of State George Marshall, the famed general from World War II and someone who commanded Truman's awe and respect, Marshall believed partition of Palestine would needlessly complicate America's position in the Middle East and spoil chances for any long-term peace. Others, such as diplomat Loy Henderson, fiercely opposed a Jewish state as a matter of anti-communist strategy, arguing it would drive all the Arab states into the arms of the USSR, depriving the U.S. of precious oil.
The pro-Zionist forces in the government were led by Truman's domestic advisors, such as White House counsel Clark Clifford, who always led with electoral considerations, and David Niles, a longtime advisor who was well connected to the Zionist movement both in the United States and Britain. For these White House political operators, not only was a Jewish state an attractive moral and political solution for the fate of the Jews of Europe post-Holocaust, it was also part of a strategy to win the votes of the Jews of America. These two camps, the foreign policy brain trust against the domestic political brain trust, fought for Truman's mind. And while he had his own personal distaste for a Jewish state, the president was so overwhelmed and repulsed by the entire struggle that he was not above ceding responsibility, passing that buck.
The White House had international players to consider as well. The proto-Israeli government in Palestine, known in these years as the Jewish Agency, as well as the Arab states such as Jordan, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. The Soviet Union, which will surprise Washington and probably more than a few of its own ministers in one key moment, and of course, the British Empire, which had a long history of governing this territory and suppressing revolts from both the Palestinian and Jewish inhabitants. But there was one group rather central to the issue that was missing. Rashid Khalidi spoke to us about how, unlike the Zionist leaders, whether from America or Britain or Europe, the Palestinian leadership was essentially cut out of most of the process in these years.
As far as I know, the United States had no contacts with the Palestinian leadership. The Palestinians were not really represented at Lake Success or later venues of the United Nations in that post-World War II period. And the Palestinian leadership was in a state of total disarray up to and including 48, and then even more so after 48. In fact, after 48, it disintegrates, basically, with the disintegration of Palestinian society under the hammer blows of what Israel was doing to conquer the country. And so it was a totally unequal contest. Right after 1945, the Arab League tried to create something called the Arab Office, which was meant to be a diplomatic arm. And part of the problem was it was the Arab League that was doing it, not the Palestinian leadership. But the people involved were mostly Palestinians. Musa al-Alami was the head. Albert Harani was involved. I know a bunch of other people who played major roles in politics later on were involved. And it was a pretty competent outfit. And they had an office in London and they had an office in New York. Or I think Washington, actually, not New York. But nobody listened to them. That was the problem. The thing was riven by disputes between leaders. The Mufti still had some influence, and he was afraid of rivals like Musa al-Alami. And so, the kind of internal problems that Palestinian leadership has sometimes suffered from affected the effectiveness of the Arab Office. And so, basically, the Palestinians were not allowed to come to the table, even if they'd had a coherent, powerful, diplomatic, public diplomacy weapon. Nobody wanted them there. Again and again, it is the major theme of Palestinian history. You have an American president who puts together a so-called board of peace. It has not one single Palestinian. So, from Balfour, who makes decisions, and the British cabinet, who make decisions in 1917, to Trump in 2024, you have a succession of Western leaders who completely ignore the existence, let alone representation, of the Palestinians.
From 1946 to 1947, here is what Harry Truman wanted: the establishment of a binational state, neither Jewish nor Arab, which would prevent seeding any ethnic or religious war in Palestine. The Palestinian leadership found this less offensive than a Jewish state, for obvious reasons, but in these early days, some still pushed for preserving Palestine as an Arab state, and all believed they could push for better guarantees against increased Jewish immigration.
Which meant that the second policy Truman had endorsed, the allowance of 100,000 Jewish immigrants into Palestine, was less than appealing to the Palestinian leaders. The reason that idea was even entertained is that at this moment, in the immediate aftermath of the Nazi Holocaust, thousands of European Jews languished in displaced persons camps, or DP camps, in countries that had, well, let's just say, less than reformed attitudes toward the Jews inside their borders. Most Western audiences were receptive to the idea that these ragged survivors could and should be allowed to start new lives in Palestine. Truman certainly did, either as a sop to the Zionist movement that he was pissing off, or as a genuine consolation to European Jews. And in the Western media, not to mention in Western politics and civil society, displacement of this unfamiliar group of people called Palestinians received almost zero consideration when compared to the suffering of the European Holocaust survivors, who, by the way, the US and Western Europe declined to admit into their own countries, conscious of the political unpopularity of taking in the remnants of European Jewry.
And in the 1940s, even though people were horrified in this country, in the United States, by what the Nazis were doing to the Jews in Europe, and then after the war, more so, public opinion still did not want a large number of those Jewish DPs to come from Europe into the United States. And Truman, in retrospect, it seems very much to his credit, was offended by this and wanted to make provision for a significant immigration of Jewish DPs from Europe. But he, like Franklin Roosevelt before him, knew there was a brick wall of opposition in Congress to this. Even if large numbers of members of Congress were busy signing on to legislation saying, or symbolic resolutions saying there should be a Jewish state in Palestine because the poor Jews need to have some place to go, but not here. To a lot of Americans, after World War II, this Palestine option seemed like a really good solution for the deep problem that was much on their minds, which was that of the Jews. And of course, as you say, we're not thinking much of the Palestinian Arab population. That was perceived very dimly to most Americans. And there weren't that many Palestinians in the United States. And they weren't the kind of cultural, social, demographic, and political presence that the Jews were. Truman was explicit, saying, I don't have a ton of Arab American constituents. I got a lot of Jewish constituents.
But not every power player favored the policy of 100,000 Jewish immigrants to Palestine. Notably, the U.S. State Department and the British Empire, and the former largely opposed it to preserve good relations with the latter. The British Prime Minister would in fact cable Truman that there was still an offer to send DP camp survivors to North Africa, not Palestine. The Zionists, especially the hardline Rabbi Silver in America, flatly rejected anything short of a Jewish state, but losing an even lesser demand, such as the 100,000 immigrants, was unacceptable. AZEC generated a wave of public pressure, 200,000 letters to the White House in protest of any backsliding on the immigration issue.
Truman and the British viewed the 100,000 Jewish immigrants in completely opposite ways. Truman thought that this number was a compromise that would satiate the demands for a Jewish state, while his British counterparts thought that it was a concession that would only increase the push for a greater one. The British had their own internal contradiction to deal with. They didn't credit or trust the Americans in the Middle East, yet they were desperate to get out of it themselves and stick the Americans with what had until then been British problems. The militant Zionists in Palestine, no stranger to terror tactics against the empire, used this moment to launch attacks on the British for the Crown's lack of support. As John Judas writes, quote, with its economy tanking and the Soviet Union threatening Britain's presence in Greece, Turkey, and Iran, the British could ill afford to put down another rebellion in Palestine, end quote. And this would, however, lead them to work with the Americans to mitigate whatever damage might happen in the meantime.
Hence was born the Anglo-American Committee, which would forever be Truman's favorite and non-existent solution to the problem in Palestine. The committee recommended a compromise. The 100,000 immigrants could be allowed into Palestine, but there would be other destinations for DPs in Europe, and the state created in Palestine would be secular and binational. Still, Arab leaders denounced the report of the committee, largely responding to the approval of Jewish immigration. One protest in Lebanon saw a U.S. government office burned to the ground.
That was only the beginning. Truman got ahead of the British in public statements, poisoning the U.S.-UK cooperation on the committee's plan. The general sentiment of the committee still pissed off the American Zionists, who then held a massive rally at Madison Square Garden in New York and initiated a new campaign to punish the British by lobbying against an American loan to London. But all of this was a prelude to an attack in Palestine itself, when a tit-for-tat between the Irgun, a right-wing Zionist terror group, and the British authorities escalated to the Irgun's bombing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem.
The King David Hotel itself. It was in the wing on the right of the picture that the terrorists placed their explosive. And the result of the crime, the tragic scene, is like a serious incident during the Blitz. The hotel housed the British Army headquarters and the Palestine government offices, and casualties were very heavy. 65 deaths are reported, and there is little or no hope of survival for any of the 58 missing. Nearly 50 others were injured. The Jewish terrorist organization, Irgun Tzvai Leumi, openly admitted responsibility for the bombing. Many arrests have been made. Leaders of the Jewish agency have expressed horror at the dastardly crime perpetrated by a gang of desperados. Mr. Attlee in the House of Commons declared, the British government will not be diverted by acts of violence in their search for a just and final solution of the Palestine problem. President Truman, condemning the wanton act of terrorism, added that America and Britain are conferring on steps to be taken to implement the report of the Anglo-American Palestine Committee. Undoubtedly, the people of Britain anxiously wait for the announcement of a policy which will prevent the loss of any more innocent lives.
"91 people died. Some British colonials, some Arab, some Jewish, and over 40 were injured. And President Truman called it an inhuman crime, but vowed that it would not undo the progress of the Anglo-American Committee."
In a July meeting with the British, the Americans discovered that they had by now given up on a unified Palestine. The plan now would be a classic imperialist model, a federation split up among ethnicities with a joint national legislature and the British controlling the finances and the foreign ministry. Quote, "The coast would be Jewish, the inland Arab, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and the Negev would be under direct British control," writes Judas.
This idea, named after the American and British reps negotiating it, was called the Morrison-Grady proposal, and Truman liked it. Talking to his Secretary of Commerce, famous progressive and leading Zionist Henry Wallace, Truman admitted that the Jews were getting the best part of the deal. The coastal areas and best agricultural lands went to them. But Truman was satisfied that there would still be a multinational character to Palestine, rather than being turned into a Jewish state.
But once again, the hardline Zionists in America and Palestine itself were scandalized by Morrison-Grady. The plan leaked before the White House could announce it. And there was yet another campaign by AISAC and their agents of influence in Congress. Truman, who thought he'd finally grasped a workable plan, cursed the Zionists, quote, "The Jews aren't going to write the history of the U.S. or my history," end quote. Yet the president, while playing the tough guy, was actually terrified of any political scandal snowballing and quietly signaled his abandonment of the Morrison-Grady plan.
By now, in response to the stalemate over Morrison-Grady, there emerged a new tendency in the Zionist cause. The hardliners still rejected anything short of a total Jewish takeover and conversion of Palestine into a Jewish state, but more pragmatic types revived an older idea in order to secure a partial and, the thinking went, therefore more realistic victory: partition. 2 states, 1 Jewish, 1 Arab. What was the difference between this and the previous plan for a federation? Essentially, more control over borders and foreign affairs for the Jewish state, which, in its backers' sense, was indeed self-determination, albeit one whose aim was to colonize another territory.
The idea of partition was, quote, meant to draw in Truman and officials of the State Department, who the Zionists knew had been favorably disposed to the Morrison-Grady plan. Per Judas, the Jewish agency, again, the precursor to the Israeli government, their envoy to Washington was worried that the British would pass the next deal to the UN, where Arab countries had seats and the Jews did not to mention the fear of a Soviet veto.
As partition gained prominence among some of the Zionists' sympathetic American officials and their begrudging British counterparts, partition's supporters were happy to find that it had some backers in the Arab states. But most Arab leaders, even if they liked partition just fine in private, told the British they should present it to the world as a fait accompli, since those Arab populations, not their leaders, would despise the measure. Otherwise, said Arab leaders would have to reject it publicly. And this is precisely what happened after an attempted conference was boycotted by the Palestinian Arab leadership, and subsequently Arab countries' own leadership played up the hardline position.
The lack of any strong alternative was a big advantage for the Zionist cause in the United States. In 1946, writes Judas, the Zionist lobby had a chance to threaten the Democratic Party's control of the country's direction. A little over a third of the Senate and the entire House was up for re-election. The Democrats had controlled both bodies since '32. If the Republicans could take back one or both houses that November, they would be able to block the president's agenda or even enact their own. That would mean, among other things, crippling or reversing the New Deal reforms passed during the Roosevelt years, end quote. Most notably in New York, but also in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Maryland. Quote, a shift of a few percentage points toward the GOP in the Jewish vote could make a large difference, end quote.
AZEK went to work, not only with direct pressure on Truman, pressing the flesh and whatnot, but also with a media campaign in New York City papers. Truman, still personally opposed to a Jewish state, capitulated in order to smooth things over and avoid what to him seemed an unnecessary electoral problem. In what is called the Yom Kippur Statement, Truman vaguely put the United States on a track to accept partition, and with it, a Jewish state. The shape and borders of that state were still to be determined. The leading Zionists still desired a complete takeover of Palestine, Jewish rule over all Arab inhabitants, at least those that did not flee to other Arab states. But their allies knew that there must be some kind of compromise.
In February of 1947, the British announced that after all this back and forth, stalled talks, and crossed wires, they would cut and run from Palestine, handing things over to the United Nations. As we recall from our Korea season, at this moment in history, the newborn UN was oftentimes an appendage of U.S. foreign policy. So Britain's handover to the UN was, in many ways, a secret handover to the Americans. In any case, the UN Special Committee on Palestine, or UNSCOP, was now the locus of Palestine's fate.
Presciently, one British representative from the now defunct Anglo-American Committee said at this moment, quote, British evacuation without any solution being provided will lead to the Jews capturing the larger part of the country and thereby obtaining very much more territory than under organized partition, end quote. And another prescient thought from Ralph Bunche, the American rep to this UN body, who wrote in his diary, quote, the danger in any arrangement is that a caste system will develop, with backward Arabs as the lower caste.
But such objections were often dismissed in ways that are familiar today. Even at this early stage, supporters of the Zionist project were quick to label opponents anti-Semitic. In attempting to scuttle a critical appointee to an ad hoc committee at the UN, quote, Truman aide David Niles circulated an unsigned note on Ambassador George Wadsworth, which described the official as an anti-Semite and an anti-Zionist.
And then, a plot twist. Up until now, in May of 47, the Soviet Union had rejected the creation of a Jewish state and supported exclusively a democratic multinational state of its people, meaning an Arab-majority state in Palestine. On May 14th, the Soviet rep to the United Nations, Andrei Gromyko, reiterated as usual the Soviet support for a, quote, independent, dual, democratic, homogenous Arab-Jewish state. But then, Gromyko went on to say that if this plan proved to be impossible to implement because of the deterioration in the relations between the Jews and the Arabs, then it would be necessary to consider the partition of Palestine into two independent autonomous states, one Jewish, one Arab.
What explains this? The Soviets, who governed a state that was one of the more elegant accommodations to national and ethnic diversity in a large country, and supporters until now of a secular binational Palestine, flipping to endorse the creation of a Jewish state. The U.S. believed that the Soviets were placing a greater emphasis in driving out Britain from the Middle East over the best interests of the Palestinian people. Quote, but there was probably an added factor, theorizes Judas. In the U.S., the Soviet Union hoped to build opposition to the Truman administration's Cold War policies among the remnants of the New Deal Popular Front. This was led by former Vice President and cabinet official Henry Wallace. Jewish liberals and leftists were an important part of this New Deal coalition, and many of these Jews were Zionists. By favoring partition, the Soviet Union hoped to curry favor among them, leading them to question the administration's Cold War policies, as well as its policies in Palestine, end quote.
Whatever Moscow's motives, the Palestinians boycotted the UN Special Committee on Palestine, while Zionists schmoozed its officials. And furthermore, with partition now seeming inevitable, the plan decided on by the UN Committee was favored by George Marshall, as well as other key U.S. foreign policy advisors. And pro-Zionist domestic advisors were already hard at work, quote, recruiting Democratic officials to remind Truman of the effect that opposition to a Jewish state could have on Jewish voters in the 48 presidential and congressional elections, end quote.
The Cold Warrior, Loy Henderson, still fighting against the tide, held out for a way to forestall partition, which remained in his mind a poison pill for U.S. relations with the oil-rich Arab world. He was grilled in front of Truman by Niles and Clifford until Truman got up, grunting, "Oh, hell, I'm leaving." Truman later remarked that, quote, "George Marshall is handling this thing." This was, more or less, the encapsulation of Truman's entire approach toward the battle over Palestine. At the end of November, partition passed at the UN subcommittee, but it was one vote shy of passage for the General Assembly. Quote, "The Jewish agency swung into action, getting the vote delayed and building greater support so the plan would pass," writes Judas. One advisor said he had, quote, "never in his life been subject to as much pressure as he had been from Jews in the 3 days beginning Thursday morning and ending Saturday night." It was still close by one vote, but the Zionist movement secured its win.
Now that partition was on the agenda, the British announced that they would simply be packing up and leaving, generally annoyed with the entire plan for the process. The Americans, not much more committed, threw their hands in the air and said they would not supply any troops or military force to carry out the partition plan that they had just supported. The U.S. recommended a set of smaller member countries enforce this partition. Rabbi Silver, the head of AZEC, remarked, quote, "We marshaled our forces, Jewish and non-Jewish opinion, leaders and masses alike, converged on the government, and induced the president to assert the authority of his administration to overcome the negative attitude of the State Department."
Celebrations among Zionists and their supporters happened alongside a walkout at the UN by Arab delegates. Meanwhile, protests erupted in the Arab states and violence spiraled in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Jaffa.
The breakout of war in 1947 between the Palestinians and the nascent Jewish state reversed confidence in actually carrying out partition, and then coming up with a recognition of the so-called facts on the ground.
From the outside, it was assumed that the Jews in Palestine would be fighting to keep their heads above water, when in fact, their superior organization and military wares made them the strong horse. Early on in 1947, the Palestinian resistance hit the Jewish Haganah army hard in the north, but a new strategy would aim to secure the borders of the proto-Jewish state. Quote, "Villages that housed militias or that were on or near critical roads were to be taken, cleansed, or destroyed." In April, the Irgun and other Jewish paramilitary forces, with the support of the Haganah, carried out one of the most infamous massacres of the war at Deir Yassin, a village outside of Jerusalem. Despite the village declaring itself neutral, the Jewish forces killed over 100 Palestinian men, women, and children.
Massacres like Deir Yassin and the expulsions of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, these were not improvised events. For years, Jewish leaders like David Ben-Gurion, soon to be Israel's first prime minister, had explicitly supported a policy of Arab population removal. Plan Dalet is what the rough blueprint for this policy was known as. According to the Israeli historian Benny Morris, quote, "Ben-Gurion clearly wanted as few Arabs as possible to remain in the Jewish state. He hoped to see them flee. He said as much to his colleagues and aides in meetings, but no general expulsion policy was ever enunciated, and Ben-Gurion always refrained from issuing clear or written expulsion orders. He preferred that his generals understand what he wanted done.
Thanks to the anti-British endorsement of a Jewish state from Moscow, the Zionists received fresh weapons from the USSR's ally, Czechoslovakia, not to mention a freer hand as the British evacuated. That, paired with the unrelenting campaigns of Jewish terror groups such as the Irgun, flipped the balance and put the Jews on top, not as a motley crew of embattled settlers, but as a conquering army. The first wave of Palestinian refugees, around 300,000, fled during this period, inaugurating what is known as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. An American consul in Jerusalem wrote to the State Department, quote, "The British Palestine government has generally ceased to function, and central public services no longer exist. In Jewish areas, Jews have taken effective control and are maintaining public services within those areas. In Arab areas, only municipal administration continues, without any central authority. Morale following Jewish military success is low, with thousands of Arabs fleeing the country," end quote. Meanwhile, in another expression of divergent interests of the Palestinian leadership and the Arab state leaders, the Palestinians were barred from forming their own provisional government.
Through these tactics, by the spring of 48, the Jewish settlers were set to take over far more than even the generous partition plan had allotted them. The victory of the Jewish forces emboldened the Zionist movement in America, just as Truman's White House was beginning to consider an alternative to partition, which UN Ambassador Warren Austin articulated in a speech. And the Zionist camp quickly accused the administration of being puppets of big oil. Media outlets like the New York Times also condemned Austin's speech. Eleanor Roosevelt, acting more out of an evangelism for the United Nations as opposed to hardcore Zionism, threatened to resign her position as UN rep.
The shrapnel hit Truman directly in the form of Henry Wallace, who was challenging the president in the upcoming elections. Wallace was, at this stage of his career, a leading progressive Democrat, accused often of being soft on the Soviets, though his language here may surprise listeners today. Truman, Wallace declared, talks like a Jew and acts like an Arab. But it wasn't the language that scared Truman. Quote, "If Wallace could siphon away Jewish votes the way a recent candidate in the Bronx had," writes Judas, "he could easily deny New York to Truman. Nationally, Truman's approval rating was 36%. Some top party figures were calling for him to get off the ticket," end quote. Party bosses, some of them Christian Zionists, warned Truman that he needed to recognize the Jewish state or possibly lose in 48.
Things came to a head inside the White House in a standoff between George Marshall, the Secretary of State, and Clark Clifford, the Politico. Clifford's key point was that the effort to secure a truce and establish a trusteeship had failed, writes Judas, who synthesizes Marshall's and Clifford's account of the meeting. Partition, at least as the Jewish state was concerned, was a fact.
Therefore, a recognition of a new Jewish state was more or less a fait accompli that the U.S. could rubber stamp. Quote, Marshall's face reddened as Clifford spoke, and when Clifford was finished, Marshall turned to Truman. "Mr. President, I thought this meeting was called to consider an important and complicated problem in foreign policy. I don't even know why Clifford is here."
Truman, though usually desperate to please the esteemed Marshall, quipped back, "Well, General, he is here because I asked him to be here." Team Marshall countered Clifford's logic that recognizing Israel would make the president hostage to fortune, and voiced open disgust over how much this was really about domestic politics. Marshall more or less ended the meeting when he said that if the president followed Clifford's logic, he'd vote against the president. This rattled Truman, who, now fully abandoning any real leadership on the issue, both instructed the State Department to negotiate a trusteeship and told Clifford that he could take another run at his case later. "I can't afford to lose General Marshall," he said.
At a press conference, Truman demurred on a question of whether he'd recognize a state of Israel should it declare itself. But behind the scenes, he was getting buried by Democratic operatives and Zionist power players to recognize it. Truman, the tough guy, begged his aides to figure out whatever move on Palestine would bring this political heat down. Here's Truman in his own words from a sort of retrospective interview conducted years after the fact.
But don't think that decision to recognize Israel is an easy one. I had to make a compromise with the Arabs and divide Palestine. The Jews wanted to chase all the Arabs into the Tigris and Euphrates River, and the Arabs wanted to chase all the Jews into the Red Sea. And what I was trying to do was to find a homeland for the Jews and still be just with the Arabs. But when you go into a thing of that kind, the people you help most are the ones that get most angry with you. Both of them were against me on the situation, but as President of the United States, I paid no attention to them, carried out what I thought was right, and I had the support of the Congress, and I could do it, which is unusual in these days.
Could you tell us specifically that a lot of Jewish people were against you, too?
Oh, well, there were a lot of Jewish people against me because they wanted the whole of Palestine. As I say, they wanted to drive all the Arabs into the Tigris and Euphrates rivers.
Then, on May 14th, 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared the new State of Israel. 11 minutes later, the United States recognized it de facto. Borders were not settled, and Israel would move to conquer as much of the remaining land in reach as it could. The next morning, at a meeting with advisors, Truman spotted Clark Clifford's lieutenant, Max Lowenthal, smiling. He asked him why. "I'm smiling," he said, "because you are going to win the election."
There had been an expectation, naive or foolish or both, that this recognition itself would bring peace to the territory. That didn't happen. Wider war kicked off almost immediately. The Arab states, primarily Jordan and Egypt, attempted, if anything, to enforce the UN partition plan as Israel attempted to gobble up as much land as it could. The UN representative was blown up by the Israeli Stern Gang, a paramilitary group. And where Palestinians remained along Israel's warpath, their homes were given away to the influx of Jewish immigrants. During a delicate pause in the fighting, Israel blew up one of its own fuel trucks to blame Egypt and then resume the war. That worked. The United States spent the entire war trying to rein in the Jewish state it had just recognized. That did not work. When all was said and done, another 400,000 Palestinians were turned into refugees.
Witnessing the victory of the Israeli conquerors, the skittishness among those at the Pentagon or in the oil companies began to fade away, and they could start to reconcile themselves to the idea that Israel may be compatible with the goals of American military and industrial supremacy across the globe.
Irene Genzier, in a book which she wrote about 1948 and American decision-making, shows that at a certain point the oil companies and the Pentagon shifted in 48 during the war, during the 1948 war. The oil companies realized we probably can protect our interests here, even if Israel is established. And they're always wary of Israel, critical of Israel up to a point, but their overt hostility decreases and diminishes. The Pentagon starts from, she shows that from as soon as the first Israeli victory in 1948, the Pentagon realizes these guys can whip anybody. This is a serious army. This is a PALF. This is a Western country which can defeat these non-Western armies. And so the Pentagon shifts its position in the course of the war. And Irene is Professor Genzier is the first person to, I think, go into this and show how that shifted.
Judas sums up, quote, "Jordan got the West Bank and Egypt got Gaza. The real losers were the Palestinians. For Zionists, the war was a triumph. When they began colonizing Palestine in the late 19th century, the Jewish population was somewhere between 6 and 8%. In November 1947, Jews still constituted only a third of Palestine's population. But the UN partition of November 47 gave them 56% of Palestine. And by October of 49, the National Security Council reported that the Jewish state would make up, in fact, 78% of what had been Palestine. Harry Truman would go on to become frustrated with Israel at several junctures, especially over the refugee issue and the right to return, but he never paid any serious attention to the question of Palestine again.
We had several other people in the country, even among the Jews, the Zionists particularly, who were against anything that is to be done if they couldn't have the whole of Palestine and everything handed to them on a silver plate so they wouldn't have to do anything. It couldn't be done. We had to take it in small doses. You can't move 5 or 6 million people out of a country and fill it up with 5 or 6 million more and expect both sets of them to be pleased. We had all sorts of objections to everything that was done. Something had to be done. We went ahead and done it and had it done, and now it's working out. Eventually, I think we'll have them all satisfied, but it's going to take a great deal of time yet to get the job done.